Good morning. We are continuing our study of Hebrews chapter 1. Our kids are remaining in the service with us this week. So kids, I'm glad you're here with us. The theme of this series is that Jesus is greater, and that's actually the argument that the author of Hebrews is laying out in the entirety of chapter 1. It's part of the author's argument before he goes on to some exhortations in the following chapters. But why we need to know this, because our hearts also tend to forget who Jesus is and what he has done. And I recognize that, especially during this Advent season, as a believer, if I'm in the place where I know Jesus is great and worthy of worship, but at this point in my day, I really couldn't give you a good reason why I love Jesus. That's really a hard place to be. As followers of Jesus, we want our love and our worship for Jesus to always be on the front of our minds and the tip of our tongue. And that's what the author of Hebrews is trying to lay out for us this week. So it's my prayer that as we get to look at these various passages in the Old Testament that illustrate the argument, Jesus is greater, that would stir something in your heart where you can agree that, wow, Jesus is greater than I can comprehend. So the author of Hebrews begins this letter by showing that Jesus is greater than the prophets. Long ago, at various times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in the last day, he has spoken to us through his Son. Jesus isn't only speaking God's words, but he's showing us who God is, because he is the exact imprint of God's nature. Jesus is the Son. Jesus is the heir. Jesus is the one who created all things. Jesus shines forth the glory of God's nature. Jesus' mere words hold everything together. Jesus is a purifier. And after his work was done, he sat down. Jesus didn't just deliver the message that was spoken by him in his words, he lived it out in front of us. God has spoken to us through his Son. Listen to him. So we've made the argument that we need to listen to Jesus in two short verses. But one question that may be facing the Hebrew listeners is, do we worship Jesus? Because you see, the Jews believed in and feared and worshipped the one God, Yahweh. Have no other gods before me. So how does Jesus fit in with this I am, who is only one God? And they may have been tempted to think that perhaps Jesus is just a glorious messenger that God uses. Because throughout history, if you remember, God had communicated very important messages through glorious supernatural creatures called angels. And God's people had a category for these messengers. They remembered when angels had appeared. So perhaps Jesus is greater than the human messengers, the prophets, because he's supernatural. And he's really just one of God's servants come to speak to us. Added to this, there appears to be a Jewish tradition that God delivered his law through the angels. If you remember from Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is giving his sermon, and he said, "You who received the law as delivered by angels did not keep it." So there would have been some tradition or perhaps truth in the fact that God used angels to deliver his words, his message to God's people. So as the Hebrew listeners try to sort out in their own minds who this Jesus is, the author of Hebrews wants to make this very clear. Jesus is far superior to angels. Now, kids, as you're listening to this, I realize we have in our mind what angels might be. And I want to ask you a question. Do you think angels, are they cute or are they scary? So think about what we know about angels in the Bible. When do we see angels appear? The first one I can think of, Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are sent out, and God sends an angel with a flaming sword to guard the gate of the garden. Is that angel cute, or is it scary? Scary. Next time I can think of an angel, we could go to Lot. When he is rescued from Sodom and Gomorrah, God sends messengers to Lot to drag him out of the city because he isn't quite leaving as fast as he wants to. And then he sends those angels to send fire and brimstone on the city. Cute or scary? Sounds scary. The next angel I can think of is in Exodus. During the 10 plagues, God sends the angel of death to destroy the firstborn son of everyone who does not have blood above their door. And go on from there, you can think of the angel that appeared to Balaam's donkey. The donkey could see the angel, Balaam couldn't. The donkey was afraid. Think of the angels that closed the lions' mouths for Daniel in the lion's den. Or in the New Testament, when the angels appeared to Mary, first thing she saw, the angel said was, "Do not be afraid." The first thing the angel said to the shepherds, "Do not be afraid." Not because these angels are particularly terrible beings, but when we see an angel who dwells in God's presence, the first thing we are going to be is be afraid. We also might be tempted to worship that angel. But the angel always says, "Don't worship me," right? Well, you might say, well, I wouldn't worship an angel. But I'd remind you that all people are designed to fear and be amazed at power. Angels are very powerful. So kids, let's think of something really powerful and amazing. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but if you ever got taken to an air show and an F-18 fighter jet makes a low pass overhead, probably one of the most powerful experiences I've seen. You seen that, Jack? Yeah. So when that happens, I dare you not to jump. It's impossible. They come so fast and so low, you can't see them coming until they're there. If they're a hostile jet, you're gone. We're amazed by power. That's what God made us. But I would say you can't compare the power of a fighter jet to the power of an angel. Well, you actually could. Imagine this. Probably haven't seen it. But an F-18 has to make a crash landing into the ocean. Going 300 knots, suddenly it's gone. No more F-18. Just the ocean. The waves keep roaring, the winds keep blowing. It's completely swallowed this jet. That's what happens. They're powerful. They're not as powerful as the ocean. Do you know who has the power to stop these winds and waves completely? In Revelation 7, God tells his angel to stop the wind on the ocean, and it does. The ocean's still. So God's angels, far more powerful than anything we have ever seen. When God's angels appear, you won't even notice the F-18s. So when you think of angels, and the author is saying Jesus is more powerful than angels, he's talking about something, a being that's more powerful than we can imagine. It's not talking about chubby toddlers with wings or guys in white robes. We're talking about lightning bolts, earthquakes, and tsunamis. And Jesus says, compared to me, that's nothing. So the author of Hebrews is going to spend the next 10 verses illustrating how God's Son is greater than angels using the Old Testament. He's going to show the concept of this glorious Son is actually woven into the songs and poetry and hopes and longings of the Jewish people, pointing out that you were actually really waiting for my Son. Even though the promises didn't make sense at the time, Jesus the Son, fits these promises perfectly. I also want to point out that this concept was not just for the Hebrews. Remember, God's word is Jesus speaking to us. And you might say, well, I never thought Jesus was just an angel. I mean, we know angels have golden hair and no beards, and Jesus had brown hair and a beard. Well, not really, but Jesus probably did have a beard. But we might think, well, I don't really ever thought Jesus was just an angel. But have I ever thought Jesus is just this? Perhaps Jesus is just the one I praise when I'm on a spiritual high, but when everything falls apart, I'm the one who needs to get me out of this mess. Knowing Jesus is just a religious discipline, but I'll find my actual rest in my next adventure, purchase, relationship, or achievement. Jesus is just my hope after death, but my life's worth is based on how others appreciate me or whether I meet my own standards. I'm not sure what box you tend to put Jesus into and say, well, Jesus is just this. But whatever it is, I am quite sure that it's too small. So let's read the entire chapter of Hebrews 1. You guys can stand with me, if you're able, out of respect for God's word. Start in verse 1, and we'll go to verse 14. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom he also created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God, and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son"? And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." Of the angels, he says, "He makes his angels winds, and his ministers a flame of fire." But of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. And you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end." And to which of the angels has he ever said, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? You may be seated. So, starting in verse 4 of Hebrews chapter 1, we will examine how Jesus has a more excellent name than any of God's messengers sent before him. And particularly, there are 7 Old Testament passages that illustrate this excellent name in more detail than the list we got in verses 2 and 3. Again, these are passages that would be familiar to the Hebrews, songs they would have sung, history they would have memorized. So in verse 4, we start with having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. And the first excellent name we will look at in verse 5 is that Jesus is the Son. The author asks the question, to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, Today I have begotten you. The answer, obviously, is none. God uses this special phrase particularly for Jesus, the begotten Son. And the author references Psalm 2 for this quote. And if you're familiar with this psalm, you get the sense reading Psalm 2 that Jesus isn't just a son of God. We know the Bible talks about sons of God sometimes, or refers to us as children of God. But the way God talks in Psalm 2 is really different. You can tell God is really proud of this son. Psalm is a psalm of the reign of the Messiah. And the Jews view this actually as a messianic psalm, pointing towards the coming Messiah. I'm not sure how they miss the son who's referenced here, but it's clearly here. So throughout Psalm 2, we see that in spite of man's rebellion, God's answer is his anointed son. We see God's answer to uncontrolled evil in the world is his son. The hoped-for figure called the Lord's anointed is his son. God laughs at evil rulers because he plans to terrify them with his son. God plans to take all lands and nations and peoples and give them to his son. God warns that every king and ruler must bow before and serve his son. Now, if I'm looking at my life, and I have to admit, I've done some pretty bad things. Is God angry at me too? God's answer is, take refuge in my son. Jesus has a more excellent name because the Son is the answer to everything evil, unfair, or broken in this world. He's also the only answer when I see that this evil has infiltrated my heart and my attitudes and desires. The world is broken. It needs the Son. The Jews are waiting for the Messiah. They needed the Son. My own heart is rebellious. I need the Son. The author continues describing the Son in his next quote. And this is from 2 Samuel 7:14, saying, I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. So if Psalm 2 described God as a proud father of who his son is, 2 Samuel 7 emphasizes the close, unbreakable relationship between God the Father and his Son. And I say this because 2 Samuel chapter 7 would be a really important passage to you as a Jew, because this is your promise. And here's the context. If you remember, King David, when he finally becomes king, Saul is defeated and he's on the throne. He builds himself a house. It's a pretty fine house. And then he thinks, well, God's ark is still in a tent. I should build God a beautiful house too. He tells Nathan the prophet. Nathan says, go ahead and do this. And then God comes to Nathan in a dream with this. That he is not to build God's house. But I'm going to raise up a son after you. And he will build the house, and his throne will last forever. I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. And this is the promise the Jews had, that King David's throne would last forever. But if you're a Hebrew, it's also a troubling promise because it really doesn't look like it's being fulfilled. If you remember, Solomon did come after David, and he did build a temple. But that temple was torn down. His good kingdom did not last. And while there were a few good kings after Solomon, most strayed further and further from God. So if you were a Hebrew, deep down in your heart, you would really wish that God's promise to David would come true. Because you never had a good king like King David. You didn't have a place to worship where God's presence was seen and felt like Solomon's temple. Your current leaders are far from God. Jesus has a more excellent name because he is the true fulfillment of this promise, not Solomon or any other earthly king. Only the Son could fulfill this promise. The Son cannot stray from his Father. When God says to him, I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son, that's what's missing in Israel's history. Jesus is holy. He cannot look on sin just like his Father. Only the Son has a throne that can last forever. He's unchanging and eternal, just like his Father. Only the Son can build the house. He is the all-powerful sovereign, just like his Father. What does this mean practically? Solomon's temple was raided and torn down. Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. And he did. Jesus says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And it's still here. Your king is the Son. He will never wander from God's good plan. God will always be his Father, and he will always be the Son. This is not a promise of an earthly kingdom for ethnic Jews. Jesus made this quite clear to his disciples. They were confused. This promise of a son that will reign on David's throne is a promise for you and a promise for me. You need this good king who is the Son of God. You need the Son to bring the glorious presence of God to dwell with you. What do I mean by feeling the presence of God? Have you ever wanted to be in the place where you know and can sense God is real, he is good, he is close to you, and the best thing that could possibly happen to you is that you would be closer to him? This normally happens through reading, meditating, and praying on the words that he has given us. We need God's presence to be close to us. We need a throne established forever. We need a protector from our enemies. When we sing the verse, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love, we confess we need a good king that will guard our heart and keep us near God's good and safe plan. So the author's first argument is Jesus has a more excellent name because he is the Son. The second argument he brings is Jesus is more excellent because he is supreme over every power. Verse 6 says, when he brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. Now Luke's account of Jesus' birth reminds us, when Jesus entered the world, a great multitude of heavenly hosts glorified God. So that was fulfilled. But the author here is actually quoting the last verse of Moses' final words in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 43. In Deuteronomy, it's translated in the ESV as, bow down to him, all gods. So the author of Hebrews is making the argument, God intends and requires that his Son is worshipped. And if we look at Moses' song in Deuteronomy 32, his final words are recounting God's justice, how he is provoked by rebellion, enacts vengeance, and displays wrath. And this is the same passage that Jonathan Edwards based his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, that Jim read for us a few weeks ago. It's a serious and sobering passage, Moses' final instructions to his people. The author of Hebrews here is referencing Moses' final warning as speaking of the Son. This passage describes the Son as perfect faithfulness and justice, who is also intensely jealous of his people's worship. Now, why does a son who must be worshipped matter? And I think we can see that no angel could be perfectly good and just and at the same time demand worship. In fact, demanding worship sounds a little uncomfortable to us. But the Son can, and he does. Why is this true? Think about what worship actually is. Worship isn't simply deciding what shrine to kneel at. Actual worship that each of us does every day is recognizing that something is good and satisfying, and if I give my life to pursuing this above everything else, I will obtain everlasting happiness. It's exactly what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden when they took the forbidden fruit. This was misplaced worship. So why is it good and right for the Son to demand worship? And I think we'll see this if we look at what happens in our own lives. If I worship, my bank account, my free time, my reputation, my kids, my spouse, my hobby, I'm giving my life to something that was never meant to give me everlasting happiness. And I suspect you've experienced this each time you've been crushed by disappointment or simply bored by what's in front of you. What do we do when this happens? We lie to ourselves and say, maybe the next thing will make me truly happy. Maybe if I had a little more, I'd be finally satisfied. Or we decide, there's no such thing as everlasting happiness, and say, I'm just going to settle for so-so happiness, or better than my neighbor happiness, if I can find it. As I try to squeeze more joy out of this thing that was not intended for worship, I'm destroying that thing and hurting others in the process. And I think we see this. What happens when the thing I worship isn't enough? When we don't get what we want, it becomes more and more okay to be bitter, to be angry, to be deceitful or cruel to those around us, and we don't even see that we're doing this. But Jesus sees it, and it makes him angry. Because I've rejected everything that was good and pure and everlasting that he offers me, and I've turned to something else. I've destroyed myself and others in the process. And we see this in our world, and sadly we just say, well, that's just how the world works, nothing lasts, and everything disappoints in the end. But Jesus says, no, that's not how I made the world. He will avenge every one of these hurts with blood. Now, I know it's a very serious statement to say, if you don't worship the Son, your blood will be shed. And if Jesus is anything besides the radiance of the glory of God, this statement is unjust and unloving. I do want to remind you that Jesus does say, one day, every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess that Jesus alone must be worshipped. So one day, this statement won't sound harsh. It will be painfully obvious. And I put this statement here because I want to consider how serious it is that Jesus demands worship. The only way this makes sense is if you recognize how excellent the Son is and how serious it is to worship anything else besides Jesus. Worship him, all you gods. Let all God's angels worship him. The author continues the comparison between Jesus and angels in verse 7, saying, but the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. This is a quote from Psalm 104. And this psalm is describing the glory and majesty of God. This is a God who covers himself with lights as with a garment and makes his clouds his chariots. The angels are messengers. His ministers are flames of fire. Think about that. Jesus' angels are winds and flames of fire. The forces of nature and the supernatural, including angels, are under the control of Jesus and are here to serve him. And I think I personally have a hard time comprehending this because I have no control over the force of nature, and I may never interact with the supernatural while I'm on this earth. But this is the excellent name that Jesus has. And I'd encourage you to take some time to think about this, that the forces of nature and the supernatural are under the control of Jesus. Do I expect Jesus to be controlling the forces of nature and the supernatural? Why does this matter? The reason I bring it up is if you think back to Mark chapter 4, Jesus calms the sea. After that, he casts out the demon-possessed man. And both times, his disciples greatly fear that Jesus has power over the forces of nature and the supernatural. And Jesus rebukes their lack of faith. And I know when I read passages of Jesus and the disciples, I always think, well, I wouldn't be that faithless. I wouldn't be that dumb. But if I was sitting in the boat, would I be surprised that Jesus has power over these forces of nature? It's part of his name. It's who he says he is. So let's consider these. So we've seen Jesus is more excellent because of his position as Son. Because he is supreme over every power. And now, in verses 8 and 9, we see Jesus portrayed as a glorious ruler. Now, the author quotes in 8 and 9, Psalm 45. If you're familiar with Psalm 45, this is a love song addressed to a king. We imagine this might have been written for a royal wedding, perhaps for Solomon. And you look at the way the psalm's written, perhaps there's some exaggerations if this was a king, earthly king, because everything is amazing and perfect for this king. So perhaps it portrays a kingly son, but what is surprising is how it references the king as God. So we view this psalm as one that looks forward to Jesus. The psalmist particularly refers to the king saying, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." Yet in the next verse he says, "God your God will bless you." The king is referred to as God in verse 6, yet God is his God in verse 7. And what I find fascinating is that in these verses only makes sense if we understand the doctrine of the Trinity, that Jesus is fully God, yet as the Son of God, he is submissive to God the Father. Jesus is God, and God is his God. This psalm was written 1,000 years before Jesus came to earth. So if you're a Hebrew thinking, there is only one God, have no other gods before me, how can I worship God and Jesus at the same time? Your own poetry tells of a bridegroom who is God forever, yet God is his God. Jesus has a more excellent name because he is the glorious bridegroom. We can worship him and we can love him. Now, if you look at these verses in Psalm 45, besides clearly calling Jesus the Son as God, God is celebrating him because Jesus' rule is upright, he loves righteousness, and hates wickedness. And if you read throughout Psalm 45, the reason this bridegroom is praised is that his righteousness is the central theme of his beauty and glory. And I'd like you to consider, what does it mean that everything Jesus is and does is righteous? Do I find Jesus' righteousness beautiful and glorious? And I ask this because Jesus says he gives his righteousness to his bride, which is us, as a covering. And I think it would be helpful to attempt to comprehend what we've been given. A perfect record. Every thought, word, and action is exemplary until our dying breath. No one has ever achieved this perfect record except for Jesus. And I recognize, particularly perhaps some of you kids, when we look at our own faith, we can be tempted, to think, am I good enough to get to heaven? Is my faith real? Is my faith strong enough? If you've had these doubts, and I say this because I've had them too, I want to remind you that you are looking at the wrong thing. Look at the righteousness that Jesus gives you. It's breathtaking. God the Father brags about how righteous his Son is. You can't get a better record than this, and God knows it. This is the righteousness that Jesus is offering you. It's a gift worth taking. It's a gift worth valuing and loving and rejoicing over. Because of this, we can say, no bride has ever been loved and valued more than me. Jesus is the glorious bridegroom. The author of Hebrews continues that Jesus is more excellent because he is outside of time. He quotes Psalm 102, verses 25 through 27, saying, "You, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth at the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe you will roll them up. Like a garment they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end." Jesus is more excellent because in the beginning, he made all of creation. But unlike creation, he does not wear out with time. One day, Jesus will bring all creation to a close, but he will remain forever. Jesus is unaffected by the forces of time. And this is the king we need because we too were created for eternity. Think about this. Maybe you've heard this. When someone you love passes away, why does the statement, "Well, he lived a good life," just sound so empty? It's because we weren't just created for one good life. The natural cycle of life on earth feels so unnatural to us. Every time someone leaves, when your friend group is broken up, life circumstances changed, a loved one passes away, we miss what was lost. We grieve this loss because we were designed with souls that last forever, that it can only be satisfied by the Son who lasts forever. Jesus does not change. His plan does not change. The hope he gives us does not change. Finally, in verse 13, Jesus is more excellent because he has been given final authority. Author says, "And to which of the angels has he ever said, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet'? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation?" There is a finality to Jesus' work. God has given Jesus the authority to sit down until all his enemies are destroyed. Jesus is ruling from a position of authority, and the ministering spirits or angels are sent out to serve. Jesus is more excellent than angels because there is an end in sight. The enemies will be destroyed. And I don't know if you've ever felt that you're good at starting new projects, but it's really hard to finish them. This is not the case with Jesus. There will be an end, and he is in control over this. Revelation 21, verse 4 says this: "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." These promises are not simply wishful thinking. Jesus has control over the end, and it will come according to his plan. Can you rest in Jesus' final authority? Invite the team to come back up as we close here, remembering that Jesus hasn't inherited a more excellent name. The Son is God's response to a broken world. The Son restores our broken relationship. The Son can justly demand worship. The Son controls nature and the supernatural. The Son's righteousness is beautiful. The Son is immune to the forces of time. The Son has final authority. God says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Let's pray.